Well, hello there, friends from the internet. Welcome to this episode of Science Bro. I'm Scott, and this is the Crescent Method. I got some real quick announcements for you. We started a couple, that's the wrong one. We started a couple new YouTube channels, and sorry, I'm here today by myself, and my screens are going crazy. There we go. All right, let's start over. Hey there, welcome to Science Bro. This is Scott with the Crescent Method. Got a couple announcements to pop off first. First of all, we got a few new YouTube channels. So we started this one here called Science Bro, which I put a link in the description. This is going to be a channel that is purely cannabis specific. We like to talk about all things, and we want to make sure that we can speak as honestly and clearly as possible about topics of cannabis cultivation. On this channel, we're going to start getting really deep into some of the technical aspects of commercial cannabis and incorporating living soil systems. So I've got a couple live streams scheduled for that coming up into the new future, and we'll move this show of Science Bro, which is meant to be living soil cannabis topics. We're going to move that to its own channel. And I'll slowly start uploading videos. So far, I just got a couple on there, but we'll get that tuned up. Another thing we've been doing that I think some of you know about is we started a channel called Sidedress to focus mainly on agricultural conversations and large scale as well as market gardening. So far, we've been doing some really cool interviews with Dan Kittredge. This Saturday, which is the 27th at 12 p.m., so noon, Mountain Standard Time, we're going to go really deep into mineral chemistry. Dan has literally sat with and talked with and learned directly from a lot of these elders or gurus, or I don't like using the word guru. We'll say early elders and mentors in the soil chemistry community. So I'm going to go over some of my data that we've learned in the cannabis space applying these principles, and Dan is going to give a little bit on history, so go ahead and check that out. Again, I put a link in the description of this video, and so I would say go ahead and check those out. We're trying to be more proactive on the YouTube front. I'm a professional consultant that likes to be a professional consultant. I've had to kind of learn how to do this YouTube thing, and we really sat over this holiday break and kind of really evaluated kind of everything that we do. That's Sarah and I's method. We kind of end the year, farming kind of winds down. Most people take off for the holidays, and we basically analyze everything that we did the previous year and kind of set goals for the new year. One of our main goals was just getting better at this YouTube thing. We're world class at commercial living soil consulting, and I feel like I'm just kind of barely acceptable at this YouTube. So we are going to make a push to be better at that and to provide more consistent content. What's up, Noah? Thanks for joining us, man. Welcome to the show. Looks like my chat thing's working a little bit better today. Another big announcement. We are starting our Masterclass series again here pretty quick. This is the basic training one here that I clicked on. Soil balancing starts next Tuesday, the February 2nd, I believe it is. February 2nd. That's a Friday. So all soil balancing classes for the next year will be on Fridays. And we will maintain that schedule throughout the year. And we're going to go pretty back to back on soil balancing master classes. And we've seen to have the highest number of people that want to go through that mineral chemistry class. So we want to be able to make sure that we can meet everybody in there. Another change that we made this past year, or at the end of this year, preparing for next year and really all years, is that if you join a master class, you get lifetime membership for that, and you are welcome to join in every session for that class into the future. We saw some really good momentum with our soil balancing class last year, which is where we started that program, and we immediately implemented it to all of our other master classes. I think the students like it. I know Sarah and I like it. We're seeing a much more rapid evolution of all students, and what's really interesting to me is we see different questions with each session. I've taught a handful of soil balancing master classes, and different questions get asked. Obviously, the same ones get covered, but it's really interesting how the group kind of determines what gets talked about in those classes, and we saw people were missing out on that. So we're now allowing everybody into all classes, and then I record the question and answers for every class session, and then I upload those onto our social network, which allows you to listen to those into the future. So we got a handful of those going on. We also have some other master classes coming up. So our Crescent Method Basic Training is the one where we teach you the functional system that we teach our consulting clients. We've got the Microscope Masterclass, and some point here in the future we might do a consultant training program. That's consultant training gets asked of us a lot, and we just really want to see farmers be successful, and so we're focusing on the people that are getting their hands dirty and getting the work done. But at some point we will probably do a consultant training program, and but for now, there are people in our master classes that have obvious aspirations to be consultants. There's several people in our group that are actively consulting. And obviously, if you're in our master class, we're going to do everything we can to support you on whatever journey that is. So that's kind of where we're at with master classes. And excuse me, today I wanted to kind of give a little presentation. I was starting to put things together for the new Science Bro channel. And over these last couple weeks, I've really been looking back at, man, we've worked with, I don't even know how many farmers, several hundred at this point. I know we are well into the 2 million square feet of regulated space for commercial cannabis, which is a tremendous amount. I don't know many people in the industry that have affected that much square footage or that many properties legitimately. So we've had a pretty big impact there, which somebody's asking me what my qualifications are. Well, depends on what you call qualifications. The short answer is my wife Sarah and I worked directly with Dr. Elaine Ingham through her program, which ultimately became a consultant training program. So we were in the early days of that with Dr. Elaine, worked very directly and closely with her. If you look at the two most prominent cannabis farms in Living Soil, we consulted with them early on in their careers and put them on a path towards success. We've worked with a tremendous amount of other people. We've designed products. So the Grassroots Living Soil line pot, that was my design back in 2017. We've designed since then a Rain Science pot. So the predominant container used in living soil cannabis cultivation came from our gardens and our designs, and we created those. So I think that's a pretty good qualification. In 2018, I was brought to Macedonia, which is a country by Greece, and I was brought there by an organization to meet with their actual government. So I sat down with the Secretary General of Macedonia, which was described to me as the vice president. So I basically went to their White House and sat down with their vice president and talked about crop loss statistics that we've seen in the commercial markets. My wife and I have provided professional consulting and analytics for cannabis farms in pretty much every regulated state in the United States and pretty much every country that has gone recreational. And, in the most humble way possible, if you talk about the people that are legitimately growing the best, we've probably worked with them. And we've probably provided data and analytics for them. One thing that came up in conversation last week in a private consulting call was that we don't show plants, and that's usually a big trigger for people. Some call it a red flag, and I think that shows that people don't truly understand what we do. And so the kind of mindset of the consumer is like, well, show me your plants. It's like, well, if you've been on social media today and you've looked at something in living soil, the statistical likelihood that you've seen plants from one of our client gardens is very high. It's just, you got to understand, like we have a relationship of trust with our clients that we are the analyst, they are the public facing brand. So one of the things I'm probably really never going to do is show too much of client gardens. Even saying we were instrumental in the top 2 most influential living soil gardens is a little bit further than I'd like to even talk about as far as specifics, but people really feel like they need to know those things. And basically what we do is we analyze a facility, we find the weak points, we put some data to those weak points and we clean everything up. So we work on the soil chemistry, we work on the biological aspect, we work on the fertilization strategies. To a certain degree, we also work on procedural aspects, or what we would call cultural practices. So cultural practices would be like how you water, how you do everything, basically. That's what we call cultural practices. So I'm not sure what flag that is. Is that Costa Rica or the Dominican Republic? I'll be honest, I'm from Southern California, which unfortunately makes you not very aware of many other places. I do apologize, but let me know. We have students, darn near all around the world at this point, and so yeah, we got pretty good reach, you could say. And through this work and through the extensive work history that we have, I understand that that's not very public facing, but that's the way it works. We work in a very interesting world where we're trying to work very intimately with the best in the industry and make them as strong as possible. But we also feel a personal desire and obligation to help just everyday people. And those are two radically different worlds. And so if I speak too publicly about our private consulting work to, say, YouTube, for example, that is a significant compromise to the trust that we need in order to safely guide a farm. And so it gets really delicate to do that. In the history in this channel, we do have some case studies that are buried into live streams. And basically what it takes for me to show a client garden is that farm has to have changed ownership, gone out of business for some reason or another, or it's been many years since that relationship and it starts to become safer to talk about the specifics of that. So we have some case studies buried down in some of these live streams that are 3 to 6 years old. We're never going to really we would never share the specifics of a farm that's actively going on, and even a 1 or 2 years is a bit too much. So and I do appreciate that it sounds like a good dude. I really try to. And, a lot of people want to pin people as growers or not growers. And yes, I've grown cannabis in my lifetime, but that's never been my role. Like when I was coming up through the ranks in Southern California, the people in my network ultimately became some of the most influential people in all of cannabis, which is a pretty bold statement, I understand. But I was the data and analytics guy for those networks. So I was never the lead grower in those organizations. I calculated kilowatt hours. I calculated cost of production. I did fertilizer analysis. And so basically I was like, the spreadsheet gangster for the gangsters. So that's what I did. Now I do that for businesses and organizations in the commercial regulated markets, which is a pretty wild place. And which brings me to the point of this show, which I didn't know what else to call this other than the universal truths of living soil. And the reason why I called it the universal truths of living soil is there are consistent aspects of all cultivation facilities. It doesn't matter what state you're in, doesn't matter what language you speak, doesn't matter what continent you're on. If you are cultivating cannabis in what we call living soil, there are certain things that are completely unavoidable. And so I was trying to compile what this lists are, or the contents of this list, to share them more succinctly, because we literally talk about these in every single consulting relationship we have ever had. And so these things seem to be, no matter how much will or determination the farmer has, they don't change. And so the first one, which typically comes from the fact that large portion of the earlier part of our career was cannabis cultivators coming from a hydroponic technique moving into living soil. Now, in the current era now, you're starting to see more people that are coming directly into living soil without other prior experience, but there's still a very hydroponics mindset dominating the living soil world. And so people get hyper-focused on adjusting the pH of your water. And the reason why this is problematic is, sorry, that was the wrong button. The reason why this is problematic is is the standard pH correction products, typically the potassium-based ones, potassium hydroxide, whatever they're made out of, are extremely antimicrobial. So in searching for a specific pH of your water by adding correcting chemicals to that, you're pretty much nuking all of the biology in that soil. How hyper-focused a farmer gets on how important pH is, you don't overcome the fact that these pH correcting compounds are extremely antimicrobial. The reason why that's problematic is if you're moderately adjusting the pH of your water, but you're killing all the biology, you've already lost. And it doesn't matter how important we think the target of 6.4 or 6.2 is, it does not overcome the fact that you've now sterilized that soil. The major issue with sterilizing a soil is like what I talked about last week in the functions of species survival, in that when you pour a chemical into your soil that kills biology, all of the problems, the organisms that create powdery mildew, the organisms that drive and encourage pest and disease pressure, are going to grow back first. So every time you water with pH corrected water with traditional products, you are setting the stage very literally for powdery mildew. You are very literally setting the stage for slow growth. You are very literally radically reducing your potential for yield, trying to chase a single point. And, I came from a network of hydroponic growers in Southern California that back in the 2000s, that sounds weird to say, however you say it, back in the day, were building their own automated hydroponic systems with commonly found contactors and other sensors. And they would basically build these things that would correct the pH of your water when you were at work doing something else. And so these hydroponic systems would run without us there. This was well before the Troll Masters and all that stuff. And so I come from a network of people that were literally building systems to constantly correct pH all throughout the day so that that water stayed at a perfect 6.2 or 6.4 or whatnot. And in the context, so this is a really important concept to remember, in order for something to be true or for something to be truth, the content, so the subject matter you're talking about, needs to fit within the context. So if you do hydroponic cultivation techniques with water that is 7.5 pH, you're probably going to have some problems, most likely. You're most likely going to have some problems. So under the context of hydroponic cultivation in soilless media, pH is much more important. In the case of large volumes of soil, the pH of your water becomes less important. It doesn't mean it's not important. It just means that we need to look at other aspects of that water that are more important. So the first question I like to ask is, what is making that pH whatever value it is? So the more sodium you have in that water, the more calcium, the more magnesium, those are all positively charged and they're going to increase the ultimate pH of that water. Sometimes that's a great thing. So if you have high levels of calcium and magnesium in that water, it's going to be higher than 6.0. And if you try to drive that pH down with corrective chemicals, you might move a number on a meter. You are 100% sterilizing that soil, ranging from moderately to radically. And that is going to create most of your headache. So the first question I would ask is, what is the composition of that water and what is making that pH high? If the pH of that water is high because of calcium and magnesium, and they're in a perfect like 4-to-1 or 6-to-1 ratio, that is magical water. Don't leave it alone. Now, if that water has a high pH because of high sodium, that's a problem. And we don't need to move the pH. We need to condition for the sodium. So completely different mindset. We're not moving a number. We're conditioning a problematic aspect of that water, right? So simply adjusting pH, in my opinion, in living soil is a pretty flawed strategy. You need to, more importantly, investigate the composition of that water. So one of the reasons why I believe cannabis cultivators get so hyper-focused on pH itself is because for literally decades, agricultural labs would hang up the phone on you if you called and tried to get an analysis and they smelled for a second that you weren't some sort of legitimate food farmer, which is pretty easy to tell when a cannabis farmer calls a lab, because you immediately get asked what crop and they kind of stutter, and it's pretty obvious at that point. So they used to hang up on us. So for the culture of cannabis, the only tool we had was handheld pH pens to measure pH, total dissolved solids, and electrical conductivity. So that became the Lord of Lords and the God of Gods. And we used it to the best of our ability, and it did provide some benefit in the absence of other equipment. Now, in the era of 2024, when pounds are no longer 3,000 to 4,000 pounds, and your cost to production might be very close or higher than the value you get for that, you have to, in my opinion, it is imperative that you do deeper analytics of your process so that you can know where problems are coming from and you can know how to correct them. Now, sometimes we absolutely do correct the pH of the water. So when is it beneficial to correct the pH of the water, and what do you use? In my personal experience, there are this many products that raise the pH that are beneficial. They're usually chemical based, and those up products oftentimes are some of the most antimicrobial products. And I would put them on par with the level of biological destruction that you get with spraying popular systemic fungicides or systemic insecticides. So that's pretty antimicrobial. So pH up is not an option. There's some hydrogen-based products. In my experience, they are miserable to work with. They're really unreliable. Often it takes many hours to correct the pH, and the instructions become figure out how much you need and try to guess how much you have to put in there. And that to me is a fool's journey. It's not worth doing that. So really the only option you have from my viewpoint, after analyzing literally millions of square feet of commercial cannabis cultivation space, is that the only option we really have is using things like fulvic acid, which is an acid and will lower the pH of your solution, but there's a limit to that. You can really only put so much because this is a living system, and in a living system, you are dealing with animals in the soil called organisms. And the more products you put into that soil that the biology views as a food source becomes stimulatory. Sometimes that's beneficial. Oftentimes that's very problematic. So trying to radically lower the pH of your water with fulvic acid will ultimately also in itself become the source of pressure for things like powdery mildew because of how that swings the biology in the soil into anaerobic conditions. There's a whole lot of talk nowadays about using anaerobes. I think people are really missing a very important part about plants. Plants are what they call obligate aerobes, which means they require the association of organisms that live in a high oxygen environment. When we're doing anaerobic ferments and putting those in the soil, you're not putting in the right organisms for the types of plants you're trying to grow. If you want to grow some water lilies, knock yourself out with a ferment that's got all kinds of anaerobic organisms. If you're trying to grow cannabis, you're just going to kill it. And that's what we see. So you really do want to stay, based off all the data I've seen worldwide, is that you really want to stay in that aerobic high oxygen, and putting too much fulvic acid into your water will actually stimulate that biology. The biology will start to grow, and as they start to grow, they consume oxygen, and they will lower the pH, they will lower the oxygen in that soil, which will turn things anaerobic. Then acids are produced, which will then ultimately lower the pH. So one of the biggest issues right now in organic farming, it used to be using too much fish hydrolysate, which is stabilized with an acid, would lower the pH. The current era's issue is putting too many ferments in, which are very acidic and full of anaerobic organisms, which drives the pH down. When you drive the pH of your soil down through the application of acids or anaerobic ferments, you make calcium unavailable, and you make other minerals very difficult to access, which causes plant health problems. So just to recap, first and foremost, start with your water. the mindset of adjusting pH is not ever going to pan out well for you. You can do a little bit. My preferred strategy is a product called FPF. It means fermented plant fulvic, I believe, and that comes from Organics Alive. We sell it on our website, CGG Distro, or you can get it from Organics Alive Garden. But you got to use it very sparingly. You can really only use 1 milliliter to 2 milliliters per gallon. That's the max. And whatever you get with that is what you get. So you don't want to go too far with that. So this is a really interesting statement. So it's saying a lot of people say that it won't affect the microbes in small doses. Does the data support your hypothesis? If so, what do you suggest to lower the pH? Okay, so if you get nothing else from this show and you get nothing else from any of the messages I've provided, take this one bit right here. There are 1,000,001 people talking about biology, inferring their opinion on biology, and they've not done any data ever. None. I would so boldly say that I don't think there's other humans on the planet that have done more biological assessment of the living soil process in cannabis than my wife and I. The only person that comes close to that is Nick Tomasini in Humankind, Oregon. There's limits to everything, and it's important that when you're taking information from people that are speaking on biology, I say this really polite, but I would disregard most, if not all, of the advice or conversation that's coming with regards to biology of people that have never measured it. Because what we find is that most of what people says rarely, if ever, pans out. And one of the biggest obstacles in the living soil community, especially in cannabis, is that because we want a good outcome, we expect and assume a good outcome, and very rarely do we come to a garden that's not been measuring biology in any proper way and find that biology is appropriate for the crop that they're growing. So the information is very problematic right now, and there's a whole lot of people talking that have never done any analysis or even seen an analysis. That's kind of kooky to say, in my opinion. Like, if you don't even have a telescope, probably shouldn't talk about what the surface of a planet looks like. You know what I mean? Like, you got to get in there because it doesn't work out like what people say. So I realize what I say is in strong contrast to that, which really upsets people, but that's what the data says. So another thing that becomes very problematic is watering volumes. So if you look at strategies like Coco Core, drain to waste, even soilless media with organic nutrients, when you're talking about a soilless media, which to me that means a substrate that's primarily Coco Core, peat moss, perlite, and very small levels of compost, it's essential in those situations that you water to full saturation and water to runoff. As soon as you move into a legitimate living soil with like 1/3 compost component, so now you're talking about a soil that has 20 to 30% organic matter, where a soilless media like ProMix or even just straight cocoa might have single-digit percentages of organic matter. So the water holding capacity of those two medias is going to be radically different. So in the case of Coco Core and drain to waste, it is essential that you water to full saturation and allow a dryback. That is an essential truth of the context of that world. And the reason that is when you're working in a hydroponic environment, that is supposed to be a fairly sterile, low biology environment. You're putting chemicals in there. It's constantly knocking organisms back and kind of decreasing their populations. You as the farmer with your watering strategy is what brings air and oxygen into the root zone. So as you fully saturate that media, you push out the stale carbon dioxide, and as the soil dries back, it actually sucks oxygen into the root zone. So people get really wound up about this concept, and they're very resistant to this concept because it is essential in these other techniques that they likely have personal experience in to water to full saturation to water to runoff. When we have converted a farm from a hydroponic technique like drain to waste cocoa to actual living soil, and we do an obscene level of data and analytics and tracking of the process. If you compare the water input to those two strategies, the cocoa coir, drain to waste, pro-mix, even organic into soilless media will require 5 to 7 times the water that is actually appropriate for that living soil system. So when we are working with a farm that is moving into the living soil world, even getting that farmer to cut their water volume in half is a very difficult process, and really they should cut it by a fifth. And so why this becomes problematic is a couple simple aspects about the difference of this world of living soil. When you're working with a media that has 20 to 30% organic matter, its water holding capacity is going to be massive. and the more water that soil holds, the more you're going to be reliant on soil structure and biology that creates soil structure to bring oxygen in the root zone. So in drain to waste, you manually pump the oxygen out of that system. In a living soil system, the goal is actually to build up biological populations, and in a natural fashion, they glue all the rocks and stuff together and start to spread them out and create pore space, and then they release oxygen in the root zone. So when you are watering to full runoff or saturation, you're actually killing those organisms that create oxygen, you're inhibiting oxygen from the root zone, and you're driving oxygen out of the root zone. And there's a whole host, a cascade of events that start to happen after that. The shorter answer is you're literally manufacturing powdery mildew and mite pressure. And then where you fall on the range of problematic pests is the degree to which you're overwatering. So if that cocoa coir system requires 7 times more water than living soil, and you're on that higher end of full saturation and little dribbles out the bottom, you're probably going to end up with something like root aphids. And because when that soil is so saturated, you decrease the oxygen, literal disease-causing organisms wake up, they start functioning in nature, and their role is to break down that ecosystem because it is no longer fit for what science calls higher level plants, which is what we're trying to grow as farmers. And again, those are called obligate aerobes. They require a relationship with organisms that provide oxygen in the root zone. Now, where people have a really hard time with this, other than the obvious mental blockage of what you're trying to say and literally asking the farmer to do something that was essential and ensured success in another technique, is literally most of the problems in this new technique. That's very hard to do. And there's a whole host of problems. A lot of toxic compounds are produced under decreased oxygen anaerobic conditions, and those toxic compounds break down roots. They feed root aphids. You start to change the form of nitrogen. So when you talk about like how that translates directly to bottled nutrients, if you go to the hydroponic store and you look at the veg and the bloom formula, oftentimes on any of the good products, there's a change in the form of nitrogen in the veg and the bloom. And in the vegetative stages, when we're trying to build green biomass and leafy material, we want predominantly more nitrate nitrogen, so that's NO3. And then as we move into the flowering, reproductive, seed, flower producing stages of plant growth, the plant actually switches the type of nitrogen that it's looking for into ammoniacal nitrogen, which is NH4+. So when you are in decreased oxygen conditions from oversaturation of the root zone, the only form of nitrogen that can be present is nitrate and nitrite. So yes, you might grow pretty green looking, decently growing vegetative plant material, but as soon as you start to get into flower production, boom, that thing will explode like a powdery mildew donut. And it becomes very difficult to control going into flower. And it's literally mostly driven by water, too much water. So yeah. So now the question is, I might have answered this, but I'll more specifically answer this is, so if we have a dryback Doesn't it kill the microbes? Yes. So in a hydroponic soilless media, you want that drawback to pull oxygen in the root zone. In a living soil system, when you have that dryback, the organisms see it as desertification and they want to preserve their life, and they go into a dormant stage and they stop producing nutrients for your plant. If that process happens really slowly, they can survive when you rehydrate, but the data that we've shown shows that they really don't come back. They might come back on some other ecological timeline that we don't have time for. But when you talk about like a 70-day harvest cycle, they do not come back in that time period. So the strategy for watering in living soil systems is going to be slowly bring that soil up to moisture, and then try to moderately rehydrate the top 4 to 6 inches. Now, that will lead to the highest biological populations, but your plant still requires a deeper watering. So, but you're not going to go anywhere near full saturation. And that's a whole hour-long conversation on itself. We can give some specific numbers. But yeah. So David here is dropping in 1% organic matter can hold 16,000 gallons per acre, which is a ton. So you don't want to do that. All right, so up next, we got, this is an indoor conversation, and this is the one I get the most resistance on. People really get upset at this concept that, especially with the popularity of vapor pressure deficit. When I started cultivating years ago, we didn't even know what VPD was. We didn't have any conversations about that. I came from the Bubba Kush era when we were trying to keep humidity below 50%. And we were trying to drive the air as cold as possible. And that made the plants purple and seemed to keep powdery mildew down. The only time I even saw this concept of VPD was actually an accident in one of these warehouse centers that one of my buddies was growing in. There was another warehouse, and some of his air conditioners broke, and it got real hot. And so the humidity went up and the temperature went up. And one day he's like, "Hey man, you got to come in here and check this out." And it was the biggest flowers we had ever seen. And it was one of those really memorable moments where it defied everything that everybody agreed on before that point, that high temperature and high humidity made much bigger flowers. When we asked the dude what he thought was happening, he gave a really solid bro science answer. And he said that he thinks it was because the higher temperature had the flowers more leafy and airy, and CO2 was getting into the leaves, which is probably not very correct. Probably what's more likely happening is the reason why people hyper-focus on vapor pressure deficit numbers is because what vapor pressure deficit is driving is literally, it's the deficiency between temperature and humidity and how that causes water to move through the plant. So in order for your plant to eat food, it needs to move water through its body, which carries mineral nutrition and then leaves as vapor, which gets caught in the dehumidification. And so most people that grow in cannabis have seen when you get hot and dry conditions, you get spider mites. Well, the math behind that is as you get hotter and drier, it messes up the vapor pressure deficit, or the osmotic relationship between the moisture on the outside of the leaves and the moisture on the inside of the leaves. So when you get hot and dry in an indoor environment, it literally slows down the movement of moisture through the plant. For some reason, calcium seems to be the most inhibited by this, and a really good way to manufacture spider mites is have not near enough calcium for the demand on growth. Another factor that goes into spider mites specifically is high nitrogen. And so the combination of high nitrogen fertilization and an environmental impact that's inhibiting the uptake of calcium, boom, spider mites like you wouldn't believe. So with the advent of the Trollmaster, Arroyo, GrowLink, the prevalence of all these tools that are now making their way into smaller commercial and consumer levels, people now for the first time have the ability to measure the volumetric water content of their hydroponic substrate, which is this whole crop steering thing that you hear. So crop steering is managing the moisture in the root zone. in a hydroponic environment, when you're able to manage the moisture in your root zone, it allows you to control fertilization. It allows you the opportunity to run higher levels of calcium, because in the absence of the ability to measure the moisture accurately and control it and work with it in a rock wool or cocoa core substrate, is in the absence of that ability to control or measure, you end up finding more stability with higher levels of phosphorus and higher levels of potassium. And there's very important relationships between calcium and potassium that start to come into play with water chemistry. So prior to the widespread availability of tools that allowed you to dial in the moisture and give these little 5% shots that everybody talks about, now that people are allowed to do that, they're bumping up the calcium, which is overall bumping up the yield. We have greater control over the environment than we ever had in the entirety of commercial or consumer level cannabis. And so that's allowing us to tweak these numbers. And yeah, in a hydroponic environment, sticking to the vapor pressure deficit chart numbers does in fact increase the results. Well, one thing that is, this maybe should have been number one, but it's pretty inflammatory, so I kind of wanted to bury it in the middle. But for some reason, in an indoor cultivation facility, regardless if it's a tent, 4-light back bedroom, or a 200,000 square foot commercial facility paid for by rappers, when that humidity consistently stays above 60%, it affects with, now this is an incorrect scientific statement, but for lack of a better description, negatively affects the vapor pressure deficit of what's happening in the soil surface. So in order to have high oxygen in your soil surface, which in the top 4 inches of soil is where most of the biology is percolating, the higher you go up in humidity, the more it impacts those communities. And the short answer is you will persistently stay anaerobic, which is not the goal, when humidity consistently is 60% or more. For some reason, there's a really sharp tipping point at 63%. So if the dead band on your room, so the dead band is the high and the low point. So if the dead band in your room is, kind of only coming up to 60 and going back down, tends to be pretty fine. But if you start walking it up to 63%, boom. Same phenomenon as overwatering. You'll literally manufacture powdery mildew. You'll very literally manufacture mites. In certain situations, aphids, but it tends to be russet mites, broad mites, spider mites. If it gets real bad, if you're also overwatering, you also get root aphids. But easily turns your grow into a powdery donut. So people provide resistance to this statement because, again, just like overwatering, in the vegetative cycle, if the soil is slightly anaerobic, there are going to be a lot of organisms that are eating bacteria from that anaerobic world, and they are releasing nitrogen in the nitrate form. So again, in the vegetative stage, you can get green, lush-looking leaves during vegetative stage with high nitrates. As soon as you get into week 2, 3, or 4 flowering, boom, powdery mildew becomes very difficult to control. And if you're one of those people that likes to go higher in humidity moving into flower, you're making it worse. And then as you start to spray to control that powdery mildew, you're making it worse. And it just becomes this like carousel of disaster. And then when I suggest getting off the VPD chart, that's pure heresy. I don't know. What do I know? So you just don't want to do that. So again, this is probably one of the most consistent things. If I were to pull one thing out of this entire presentation, this is undeniably the most consistent thing. And this even spans across other consultants. So I mentioned Nick. Him and I have a good relationship. We work together a lot to try and stay at the top. We had conversations years ago where every single one of his farms, he saw this phenomenon as well. This is probably the most universal truth. So if you're growing indoors and you're battling consistent powdery mildew and mites, and your humidity is above 60%, drop it down. Well, now this causes other problems for people is because you start to get to the really undesirable ranges on the VPD chart. If you try to, pick the best green color at 60%, you end up down at like 72 degrees. And plants just don't grow indoors. And plants just don't grow indoors at 70 degrees. They might turn purple at the end of a harvest cycle, but they don't grow for shit. So you start to really radically get off of that VPD chart which is the actual solution. But that requires you to go against what everybody else is doing on the internet, which takes courage, right? And most people would rather do what everybody else says than have the courage to do something radical different. We're pretty bold over here. We don't care much what other people say. Coming up next. All right. This is a really weird phenomenon. And I'm going to take a sip and give you a little bit of history lesson. Okay. So the cannabis world has changed, right? So if you're new to cannabis, your only reality is this current era. Like David King's been growing since Jesus was in 12th grade. So he's seen a lot of changes. I haven't been growing that long, but I've been around a lot. And like I said, I was in the right place, right time, right attitude, right effort. And some of the people that I was hanging around with became quite famous in the cannabis space. So I saw some really bad dudes put some work down, and ultimately they changed the game. So I got to be a part of that and see what that was like. During that era, none of us, literally none of us, nobody was regularly spraying pest management products. This is like a new phenomenon. This is a new trend. The way I see the history as an analyst of the cannabis industry is between like around 2008 was when what I define as the comfort era of the Prop 215 in the state of California. So state of California is the biggest cannabis market in the United States, maybe in the world, and likely in the world. And it has one of the oldest histories, and it's a big old state with a lot of people that like to cultivate cannabis. Around 2009, it became pretty comfortable, and there was very low likelihood that you would get in any sort of legal trouble as long as you had your medical paperwork. So it kind of changed the market into this different world. And prior to 2008, even into the 90s, I've worked with many growers that have 20, 30 years of experience. They said they very literally, and I believe them, did not have these pest problems. I was talking to a buddy that's been growing 30 years, and he said in the early years of him growing cannabis, 1990, 1995, 1998, they would flood the entire tray with water, and it would not create root rot. It wasn't until the introduction of beneficials to hydroponics until we started seeing all, according to these guys, which, again, they were heavy hitters, I trust them, they didn't have any sort of root-borne pathogens until the introduction of beneficials into the hydroponic process. And so this first introduction of biocontrol products, by report of these dudes that were there, very literal started the problems of root rot, and there's a lot of other things that came after that. But what's important about 2008, 2009, 2010 is that's when you started to be able to put your product on weed maps, and if you sent your flower to SC Labs for a potency and a and a pesticide screening, you could sell your product on weed maps, and it kind of opened up this first era of legal-ish cannabis. And what that did is that brought a whole bunch of new people into the market, and people went from driving 100 miles to a different town to buy hydroponics equipment to casually going to their hometown hydro store and talking to the buddies, and it just became this different world. And what happened at that transition around 2008, 2009 is prior to that, you had to know somebody that knew what they were doing to learn how to do it, or you just had to be a heck of a bootstrapper and figure it out on yourself. And it was this person-to-person communication, qualified individual to new person, mentor, mentee, and that is how the information was traded. And around 2009, the hydro stores became the kings of information to the masses, and common phrases of oh, you got to rock this, bro. And it started the first era of what Dr. Lane calls the moron approach, where we just put more on and more on and more on and more on and more on. And it started this novelty and addiction to the latest, greatest thing, which none of that stuff was available prior to that. You got some bag salts from the nursery store, you got some potting soil, and kind of went for it. And so it started this change and transition of trying all kinds of different products. That is also actually, the reason why I know this is that's when I was brought into cannabis, because my family was in agriculture, and people started using were starting to use things like systemic fungicides like the product Eagle 20, and they would use systemic products for pesticides like Avid. And people thought that I could somehow get those products And so they would ask me, hey, I know your family's in agriculture. Can you get me a jug? And I would say no, but while I'm working on it, let me come to your farm and we'll talk about what the problems were. And prior to that, I had pretty good education on where bugs came from, and the crew that I was taught by didn't have a lot of bug problems. And so I kind of became this consultant trying to help people solve the problem without having them resort to systemic fungicides and pesticides. So I pretty much have a PhD in systemic fungicides and systemic pesticides in the cultivation of cannabis, which those very literally induce their own very specific problems. One of the things, because I was always the nerd that would go research stuff, and one of the things I pulled up was at that time there was a chemical compound called imidacloprid, and that was used. It was like a citrus product that people would put into the reservoir once a week. And I had one buddy that would put it in every single watering. Undeniably had the worst pest and disease problem still to this day that I've ever seen. And he was using this imidacloprid product every single res change. And so I got onto the old Google machine and went to Google Scholar and punched in imidacloprid. And there was a university study that showed imidacloprid on spider mites, which is its targeted pest, actually increased fecundity, which means the viability of the eggs, or like their ability to reproduce. It shortened the time it took to produce those eggs, and it increased the eggs that were produced, which is pretty mind-blowing. If you're using a product that's meant to be a systemic pesticide, and in lab studies increased the ability of the spider mite to reproduce, shortened the time it took to make those eggs, and then increase the viability of those eggs. It's crazy. That in a nutshell is what happens when you start doing these things. There's a book behind me right here. It's this little gold one. It's called Healthy Crops by a French guy named Francois Chaboseau. It's out of print anymore, but you can find it for download. It's called Healthy Crops. Let it be known, it's a very boring book. It's very dry. But he goes back to research in the 1950s and has chapter after chapter after chapter after chapter after chapter on products that are pesticide and herbicide in nature that the scientific studies shows a radical increase in these pest problems. In one of the chapters, he says he regrets even talking publicly about this research because he was attacked for it. I live with no regrets, but I've definitely been attacked publicly and privately for communicating this, but hey, it's what I'm here to do. It is what it is. And so we see very specific examples of chemicals. In the living soil world, it's really popular to do neem oil, which has its own host of problems, and there's a lot of contamination with neem oil. Neem oil specifically radically reduces beneficial organisms in the soil. I talk about this a lot on many live streams, but in 2018 or 19, we worked with a greenhouse facility that had two identical greenhouses. One crop, they sprayed a very moderate, very light dose, very responsible dose of what the internet suggests to use for neem oil. And we had been tracking the biology every week up into that point, and we saw like an 82% reduction in beneficial soil organisms, which translated to a 25% reduction in yield compared to its neighbors. So what you kind of get on this hamster wheel, especially in the living soil world, is as you start to spray products that are antimicrobial into the space, they start to radically hinder yield, and it literally manufactures the pest problems. So through biological means, again, it comes back to the same phenomenon of overwatering. You decrease oxygen in the soil. In a hydroponic world, nobody would ever think of taking the aeration out of the reservoir. And in hydroponics, you have the ability to pick it up and look at the roots. In living soil, you can't. And so in hydroponics, we adjusted our strategy over time to get wider and wider and healthier and bigger roots. And we could literally pick up the bucket and take a look at it, or pick up the rock wool and take a look at it. In living soil, you cannot do that. It's submerged in a bunch of dirt. You're going to kill the plant if you dig it up. And even if you try to do like a post-harvest dig up, everything's kind of a weird color because it's been buried in dirt. You tear a bunch of it apart. In past years, I've actually very carefully blew it off with an air gun. I suggest you do that sometime. It's fascinating. And take your plants, that are very big and go get like a big kiddie pool or put a tarp down. A hose can work, but it's very messy. I prefer an air gun, and you just kind of hook up a compressor and just blow it off. And you'll get to see very clearly what your root system looks like. So now we've got it. It's just crazyville, right? So prior to 2000, we'll say very little pest problems, very little spraying or treating for pest or disease problems. Those started to come into popularity in the 2000s. By 2008, 9, and 10, almost everybody I knew was spraying systemic fungicides and systemic insecticides, and I took it as a personal goal to try and not give other humans cancer and try to help as many farms as possible not give people cancer. And we've been very successful at that. And we've helped some very famous hydroponic people transition into the regulated space where they're not allowed to use these products. So that's a hard thing to wrap your mind around. And I guess to complete my thought is, in today's era, we have people that are popular on the internet that are suggesting maintenance sprays daily of pest control products. Like, please let the insanity of that statement settle into your being and space. If you are required to daily spray a crop to keep the pests and disease down, you're in the wrong section of the library. You might not even be in the building. You maybe be like way out in zebra in the parking lot. Like, you're not even really near the door of success. You are so far away. And these internet personalities, for lack of a better description, are encouraging and creating a radical shift into a focus of trying to kill things. And I try not to get too philosophical on this channel because it kind of turns people off. But if you're trying to do living soil and you're calling yourself a living soil cultivator, you should probably minimize the amount of killing you do. Like, straight up. If you take the farms that we've worked with, which is literally in the hundreds, in the millions of square feet of cultivation, and you put them into two distinct groups, those that try to kill things and those that try to never kill things, this is not even close. It's not even close, the results those people get. And you could take the absolute best person from the camp that wants to spray stuff all the time. They won't even come close to the worst results of the cultivators that try to tailor their strategy to not kill anything. And I realize that if the context of your cultivation environment requires you daily maintenance sprays, yeah, there's a lot that needs to be corrected. And if you just stop those sprays, yeah, it's probably going to erupt in a biblical level bug population, which most people in agriculture agree, in my side of the world anyways, that bugs are messengers. They're trying to communicate that this crop is not fit for consumption. And those bugs are nature's garbage collectors, and they are perfectly performing their function in nature. So if you have to daily maintenance kill shit in this system called living soil, and you call it natural farming, you're a long way from the goal, right? And I don't even know who says these things. I don't watch anything on the internet anymore because most of it's just really pretty ridiculous. But I hear regular reports of what's going on in the world, and so whoever these people are, I probably wouldn't really pay attention to them. So, yeah, I don't know. Well, so here's the interesting. So back in the 90s, everyone was using perlite. And yes, and by today's standard, is perlite good? No. I think it's Lake County in Northern California actually banned perlite because it floats to the top of the waterways and then turtles eat it or something. I don't really know what happens, but it's just bad for the environment. And so, yeah, perlite's not great, but we've come a long way, man. We've come a long, long way. We're well past the PGR times, which literally said on the bottle, this will probably cause cancer. So we don't want to do that. So I don't know if I'm ranting or making a clear description of why regular spraying of IPM products. I'll more succinctly buckle it up for you here. So when you take a product that is designed to kill a biological organism, there is 100% a negative downstream effect on the metabolism of that plant. So back in the olden days, They would use systemic insecticides that would literally damage the DNA of the plant, which lowers its productive capability. Oftentimes in the systemic insecticide era with things like Avid, the Avid would actually cause the plant to be a lighter color in green, which very directly inhibits its ability to take sunlight energy and turn it into growth. So right off the bat, you've reduced its potential, which puts you into position to over-fertilize. And once you start the over-fertilization to try and overcome what's happening as a negative detriment with that pest control product, you're now manufacturing pests by over-fertilizing, is the short answer. And there's a lot of other mode of action. So as we've moved away from the really nasty stuff that people definitely should not be smoking, one of the benefits of regulated cannabis is it definitely cleaned up the industry at wide. But again, I'm the guy that analyzes crop loss. We solved the virus issue by the end of 2017. People are still mesmerized by that. We solved it in 2017. What I say it is we moved away from one minor application of a systemic insecticide and fungicide to 3, 4, 5, 9 times a week applications of things like citric acid. And at that very transition is when viruses started to pop up. And we had that pretty well summed up by the end of 2017, probably mid 2018 at worst. And what it comes down to for me is if you're spraying regular repeated applications of citric acid, which I condone as a decent product, I use Dr. Zymes for very specific purposes. But keep in mind, citric acid is an enzyme, which is like a wrench that can undo nuts and bolts over and over and over again. That enzyme is reusable. And so it disassembles organic compounds. And as you start to spray citric acid on the leaf surfaces of the plant, you're very literally disassembling the biology of that plant, even though you can't really see it. So if you take citric acid and run it through your irrigation lines, it'll dissolve out of the biofilm and wash it out. That is exactly what it's doing to your plant. So even if you're perfectly fertilizing, even if your environment is good and you've built a plant that is strong, healthy, and has solid, fully complete cells, and you spray it repeatedly with citric acid, you're literally disassembling and creating vulnerability. And as you start to do that process, for some reason, I'm not some sort of virologist or biologist, but just what I observe is the more you apply things like citric acid, the higher propensity you have to have virus material. And as soon as you stop that and start to correct it, people talk about tissue culture, and that's cool. I don't want to try and inhibit, development in areas of things like tissue culture, and it has some purpose. But the tissue culture guys have been claiming for a decade now that they could solve the virus problem with tissue culture, and I don't see that that's true. Some of the loudest voices in the cannabis industry that their tissue culture is going to clean up the viruses still regularly ship out clone trays that are ridden with viruses. So what's interesting is in a living soil system, when you have mineral chemistry appropriate and you get to a certain level of biological activity, the plant is able to naturally rid itself of that virus material, and it cleans itself up on its own. You don't even need to do anything complicated. Like I said, we had that wrapped up pretty easy back by mid 2018. So should not be a problem today, in my opinion. So if we correct the underlying nutritional issue and in the living soil system addressed the biological issue, and you take it easy on the pest control products, the viruses actually clear themselves up. So by literally damaging the cells. So in earlier years, we're damaging DNA in cells with harsh systemic insecticides not intended for combustible, consumable products. Now we're doing it by disassembling it with enzymes. So it's not good. Now, this was a really hot topic for a lot of years, and because we are in the biology world, we've seen a lot of tea brewing. So when I came into this soil food web community, between 2012 and 2014, you saw a lot of people were brewing compost teas. And This is a very hot topic. When I say that the compost tea is creating the mite and mold problems you're experiencing, I might as well call your mom fat and say your religion is fake. People get that offended over it. And so it's a really hot topic. But the statistics would show that if you take the standards set by Dr. Lane Ingham, who developed these techniques to analyze agricultural organisms and compost tea brewing processes that actually control fungal pathogens, there's certain targets for what is proper for obligate aerobe plants. And there's certain levels of beneficial organisms you're looking for, and there's non-detectable or no levels of certain organisms that you're looking for that creates a good. So we're looking at the standard set in the compost tea brewing manual and the work of Dr. Lane Ingham. I have yet to see a farmer that has not gone through the Soil Food Web School or Dr. Lane, like legitimately went and got trained in this method of microscope technology to brew tea. I've yet to see a farmer that brews tea that would produce something that fits within that parameter of only healthy for plants. And so those that are brewing tea range from radically inducing disease in their crop through the tea brewing techniques to mildly to moderately inducing disease in their crop. And the reason why people have a really hard time going along with that narrative is basically what you're doing in a compost tea tank is you're taking compost, which contains organisms, hopefully, and you're taking a food source and you're putting them together and you're aerating it for a duration of time. And as you contribute organic food sources and biology and aeration and time, that biology grows, and then they start to break down those organic nutrients, and they're basically breaking them down into smaller and smaller parts that make them more digestible and easier to access by your plant. When you do that, you're basically increasing the solubility and availability of whatever foodstuffs you put into that tea brewer, which will 100% oftentimes create a very measurable, visible plant growth response. And so people go, tea is good. What they don't do is associate the powdery mildew that pops up 2 weeks later that very literally came from that tea. So a lot of the issues with compost tea is first and foremost the brewers. We have tested every type of compost tea brewer you can imagine. I've been putting the analytics to this process since 2012. I've crossed paths with every commercially produced tea brewer you can imagine. I've yet to find a single one that could reproduce a tea more than once that would fall within that standard set by Dr. Lane's work in the compost tea brewing manual. There's a couple pieces of equipment that you can hit the goal the first time you use the tea brewer, but because of the difficulty in cleaning them from a microbial standpoint, is they basically harbor disease-causing organisms in the pipes and cracks and crevices. If you're using an air stone, there's less than a 0% chance you're going to get that clean. You could bubble it. If people always want to talk about it, hydrogen peroxide, dude, you're not going to do it. I went to a presentation by Dr. Lane in 2012. She used to have a picture where she cut open a air stone, and in the center is just loaded with gobs of death and destruction. And you're just not going to be able to overcome the reality of nature and it serving its purpose to perform its function in nature. So we don't use any commercial tea brewing. We make our own, and we actually make them out of beer brewing equipment, because if you're going to if you're going to brew beer, it is essential that you can actually properly sterilize that equipment from batch to batch, or else you'll have contamination and you won't end up with beer. You'll end up with a stomach ache and a trip to the hospital. So the very nature of some of these pieces of equipment and tanks for the beer brewing process is much more conducive to successful cleaning. So again, people hate hearing that. Probably going to get attacked pretty good on the internet by the trolls, by people that make equipments. That's just the reality of it is. And what's really unfortunate and kind of the most disappointing part about my journey in living soil is that when I first started sharing this information publicly in 2015, the people that made these two brewers, they never came and said, how can we change our equipment to meet this criteria? They literally would call me and yell and scream and say, you're hurting my sales, you jackass. And then they would get somebody on the internet to attack me. And that's the really unfortunate aspect of the living soil world that the consumer doesn't see, is how much the industry itself is retarding growth. You know, like we're having the same conversations about tea brewing that we were having literally 10 years ago. It's now 2024. And I first started giving presentations on this in 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017. I finally gave up in 2017 because we would go give a presentation with the intention to educate the farmer. And man, this data would just, we would just be attacked over it. And you start to do a cost benefit analysis, is like, man, are people getting the value comparative to the level of attack I'm receiving for trying to communicate these things? But the reality of the world is, if you mess with people's money, they're going to mess with your ass. And there used to be a lot of money in compost tea brewing tanks. And as the industry grew in size and scope and scale, the equipment got bigger and bigger, and it got worse and worse and worse. And it's just, you can put 100 gallons of Sanidate into a tea brewer, and just through the magic of nature, there's going to be disease that is in the cracks and crevices and in the tubes and under the pieces that we like to put in there. There basically needs to be nothing inside the tank. If somebody is putting air stones into a tea brewer that also has stuff inside of it, they're literally teaching you how to brew disease and kill your crop. So, but what's so fascinating is, with the resilience of nature, you can brew literally a concoction of biological disease and destruction and just snakes and dog shit. And nature can still kind of moderately survive that process. And in this entire journey, I haven't seen very many times where somebody brewed a compost tea and it actually killed crops. So it's been very slow for this kind of concept of around compost tea to change. And like I said, the people that typically brew tea are very passionate about it. It's almost like a religion or some sort of thing. They get very protective over it. Just to give you some concept of scale, is if you go to like a typical recipe on the internet from an internet guru that says this is the tea brew recipe to use, we put those to the test. Like, I'm not up here just spouting off nonsense. Like, if there's a trend, and for those of you listening along that are consultants and have a desire to be consultant, you have to put these things to the test. Like, you have to know. You can't just ponder and pontificate. Like, if there's a recipe on the internet, we brew the tea and we try to see if we can hit the targets within Dr. Lane's ranges with that recipe. And when we mess with those recipes, typically the amount of food stuff, so the molasses and all that stuff in the tea, is usually 100 times the amount that can put you into the realm of success. So wrap your mind around that like the average recipe on the internet is likely 100 times too much stuff. And then you have to overcome the obstacle of the configuration of the equipment. It's the biggest losing battle you've ever imagined in your life. So let me just check on the stuff here. And David is right. One of the most unattractive issues, well, this has been a good and a bad thing, right, with the industry, is as cannabis has become legal and we now get the merging of cannabis cultivators and business and industry, they love technology. And I will say there's been some great things that has come out of it. You know, there's been a whole bunch of nonsense. And really kind of what happens is people try to solve problems with tech. And tech can educate you. Tech can provide insight into your process. But I've yet to see a farm that was battling an issue and solved it with technology. You know, the technology can reveal flaws in your process, and then you can correct those flaws. But like, you can't really just put like a widget on the wall and like all the bugs go away. I guess as I say that, the ability to reliably measure the moisture content in your hydroponic substrate, that is a technology that radically improves the process. So maybe that's one. You know, lighting technologies improve radically in my career, which is it's unbelievable what can be done now. Back when Colorado went legal in 2012, 13, it was we were in the Gavita double-ended era, and that was a significant jump in lighting technology from the single-endeds, and they produced a lot of horsepower, and yield went up. What's really interesting is if you look at what's called the harvest index in agriculture, which is basically the relationship between plant material that you don't sell and plant material that you do sell. I recently met a guy that produced a lot of cost of goods modeling for an organization that had like 10 farms in different states, and they had double tier, triple tier, single tier, double-endeds, LEDs, they had every type of configuration you can imagine. And they produced, part of his job was producing harvest index numbers for all the different farms. And what was interesting is the double-ended Gavita farms would produce more volume, but that harvest index, so it produced a whole bunch of stuff that you didn't sell and actually ate into the profit. But at the time those came out, that was a significant jump in technology over the single-endeds and the vented single-endeds. And yields did go up. But at that time, in the early era of Colorado going recreational, achieving 1 gram per watt of lighting was that marker for commercial viability and was a respectable productive capability. We'd work with some really good guys that would kind of get in that 1.2, 1.3 range. When the really good Cobb LEDs came out, the first time I started surpassing those numbers with LED technology was with Timber, and they had the single Cobb lights. And with an 800 watt, I think it was about an 800 watt panel, just a couple years later, we could take somebody that never grew cannabis before and on their first harvest hit 1.2 grams per watt with those higher intensity Cobb LED lights. I was using Timber. They were local to Southern California, so that just made sense. But now, now with like the Fos lights, which is a completely different realm. I talked about this a little bit on the last session. Agnetics was the first one to come out and really jump up radically in technology. They had a magnified diode, and they got more efficient with the components. But the problem was they produced so much heat, they required a hard plumb line of water, which made it, only available basically to the biggest, most funded commercial facilities. But yeah, they were, to my knowledge, farms with Agnetics were the first to group. Yeah, exactly. They were doing, I think they were the first to go over 2 grams per watt. This homie says they were doing over 2 per watt in the HPS days. I've literally never seen that in my life. I've worked with some of the most top dudes. I'm not saying it wasn't done. I'm just saying that I didn't personally see people legitimately hit 2 grams per watt. Now, there's a difference between the legacy market yield and the track and trace yield, and this really offends people too. But once we went legal, there was no fudging weights. Like, you had to weigh the leaves, you had to weigh the sticks, you had to weigh the part you threw away, you had to weigh the flower, you had to weigh the trim, and it all had to be accounted for, and it went into software. So the legacy guy would say he got 3 a light. Track and trace would say he got 2.4 per light. So there's a little discrepancy between yields that track and trace really highlighted what was actually happening. And so as I digress, the first lights I saw truly consistently hit over 2 grams per watt were the Agnetics. People can do it pretty solidly with the Fos lights. Now with the Fos lights, we've had 4 or 5 complete novice, tent growers basically, hit 1.5, 1.6 grams per watt on their first harvest, So we're in a completely new realm. People are definitely getting over 2 grams per watt with the Fos lights. It takes a little bit of more navigation with managing your nutrient. You can't just crank up the lights and magically get this higher production. You have to work up in balancing the mineral nutrition to be able to make use of that light intensity. So just kind of throwing that out there. So compost tea is like the old school problem. Now, we're kind of in a new era now, and it's moved from tea brewing to producing your own IMO. Yeah, let me just go back to this because David, yeah, it is crazy, right? And everybody goes, you're lying. And it's hard to even imagine 4.4 pounds in a light. And some of those are 1500 watt lights. It's pretty hard to get them cranked up to actual 1500 watts. And I would say that once you get them cranked up to 1500 watts, you're likely on a 12 or 14 foot ceiling. And now you're not talking about 4.4 pounds per 16 square feet. Now it's like 5 by 10. So it's just a completely different metric than anything we've ever done, seen, or talked about. And so as those lights go higher, which the A3i I think was designed to be on like a 12 or 14 foot ceiling. And if you're not like legitimately at that headspace, it's very hard to get much higher than like 1300 watts. I don't personally see in our client gardens that we even need to go that high. And if your electric bill is deduced by the amount of watts you use, if you can get a certain level of efficiency with less watts, your electrical bill is going to be less. So now that the lighting technology has made such radical leaps, I don't feel the need to max them out anymore, right? And if you're running your equipment, again, I come from a desert racing family, and if you're trying to cover 400 to 1,000 miles in the desert, running full wide open is a great way to get stranded in the desert for 9 hours, waiting for someone to come pick you up. And so I always like to run things turned down a little bit, and I don't like to max out any piece of equipment. So I put fan controllers on every fan. I turn them down 20%. I don't like to max out the lighting. And long story short, people are crushing it with the new lights. And I don't really like to talk about brands specifically because, I'm not any sort of sponsored athlete, and I'm not really trying to give anybody any free advertising, or I don't want people to like go out and buy stuff because I specifically labeled a brand. But it is undeniable that those Fos lights are in a completely different realm that other manufacturers are scrambling to try and catch up with. So we've worked almost exclusively with that brand for the last year in our new commercial client gardens, and they're doing things I've never seen before. And again, not to sound like a nobbin, but I literally came from some of the most influential hydroponic growers on the planet, and they did some pretty cool shit back in the day. And we're taking people that have never grown commercial cannabis before and literally doubling what we did just 5-6 years ago. Unbelievable time to be alive. So it's pretty cool. And yeah, the whole thing with metal halide and that stuff, I kind of came out, like the guys that I was growing with weren't really using the metal halide. A couple of them would use the metal halide in veg, and then the HPS in flowers. Some would alternate them, some would checkerboard them. I'm more of a simplicity guy, so I never did anything like that. I've seen a lot of vertical bulb stuff, but then you get cool tattoos, which is not that fun. So yeah, but we're definitely in a really cool time for technology, and that's one of the nice things of regulation is it brought new money and I would say access to benefits that we never had access to. It's brought a whole bunch of other bad stuff. I'm not saying it's great, but I never used a spreadsheet prior to 2016, and the first farms that were bringing me tea, they were like, "Why don't you have a spreadsheet, kid?" And I was like, "You're right." And so we started putting spreadsheets together. I use spreadsheets for everything nowadays. The ability to analyze your process and dissect what you're doing and look very clearly at it. Maybe someday I'll do like some spreadsheet videos. I don't know if people would actually find that interesting. If you do, drop it in the chat and I can make a spreadsheet video or something like that. But the power of math is pretty remarkable. So yeah, so we got some agreeing comments here. Mr. Blue Gilia and David King, which I would assume I know David's been around a long time based on the way Blue's talking. Sounds like he's been around a long time as well. So, and kind of the best of both worlds right now is, the big difference in the agnetics and the Fos is they were able to get to a higher wattage and PPFD and intensity by spreading out that spectrum. So the Gavita double-ended is a very sharp spike in a very narrow band, which has a limit to how high you can push that. And getting that spike absolutely increased production capability, but it definitely would stress out the plants. And what's been learned recently is you get more plant that you don't sell with that narrow band, whereas with a wider spectrum from some of this newer lighting technology, you get a much more balanced plant, and you get less plant material that you're not going to sell, which is pretty important. So we got a couple people asking for a spreadsheet video. So all right, I'll try and put something together. I guess the real reason why I haven't done the spreadsheet one is I'm afraid like it would be super boring watching me do it. So I got to figure out how to like speed it up or something. I don't know. Because I mean, it can take me a couple hours to do some basic calculators. That'd be a pretty boring video. So I'll think about it for a bit. Maybe drop in the chat what you'd like to see analyzed. Basically, where I started was for home growers in the Prop 215. I would build a calculator that allowed them to calculate their electrical usage. And I would put in the different peak and off-peak hours into a spreadsheet and put in their light intensity and try to find them a sweet spot of when to turn them on and when to turn them off that would be the most economical, is where I started. Yeah, and you would poop your pants at some of the things we do now. It's pretty cool stuff. So, all right, maybe we'll put that. It sounds like there's people that'd be really interested in that. So I'll have to figure out how to not make it like watching grass grow. So, but this one's taking longer than I expected. I'm sorry. All right, now for the finale. So what I was talking about a little bit earlier was the compost tea brewing, which was the more popular rage and the way to induce mite and mold problems. The new popular trend right now is IMO, so taking the rice ball and putting it into the forest. As regardless of how popular this technique is, you're not going to overcome the principles of biology and the principles of nature. And when you take rice and you put it into the environment, your likelihood of harvesting beneficial organisms that are suitable for production crops is almost nothing. And trying to prepare for this video, I was trying to think of how to communicate this. And what came to me during the bull sesh was say you're going to the forest and you want to catch a bunny rabbit for Easter, right? So our goal is go into the forest and try to catch a bunny rabbit. But the only thing we brought with us was hot dogs and steak. And we put it in a little wooden box and we buried it at the base of the tree and we go, I'm going to catch rabbits. But like really what you're going to catch is like maybe a coyote. You might catch, what are those little things called? Maggots. You're probably going to catch maggots. You might catch, I guess squirrels eat nuts. But nonetheless, a bunny eats grass. And if you want to catch a bunny, you got to put a box of grass at the base of the tree. So if you handmade nice little wood box and you filled one with grass and you put like steak in the other one, like you're not going to catch bunnies with steak bits. And this is the part that people are radically misunderstanding, that we've tried to communicate this concept since our presentations back in 2016. And people have not been very receptive to this because I am significantly less popular than the rice ball crew. And that's okay, but what you have to understand is rice is a simple starch, and that does not become a food source for the type of soil organisms that your plants are looking for. You are very literally going into the forest and you're harvesting very literally pathogens and disease. And so not one single time in our analysis of literally millions of square feet of cultivation space have we seen that like gray, fuzzy, mold be associated in the microscope assessment with the types of fungi that your plant is looking for. They are very closely related and very directly related to powdery mildew. So as we harvest fuzzy types of soil fungi, if you could call that, they're actually in a different family. And they're very literally correlated to powdery mildew. And when we've worked with farms that modify their cultivation practices to harvest more and more fuzzy stuff, undeniably, those are the most moldy, mite-ridden gardens of any of our network. And basically what we're trying to do at every step of the way is limit the number of fuzzy stuff that's growing, because those are just a different type of animal serving a different type of function in nature. And if you want to like decompose rice or food, that might be beneficial. But if you're trying to grow healthy crops, you're not even in the parking lot of the store that you're wanting to do. And so this has been a very popular trend. And I realize it's probably inflammatory. And this video will probably get clipped up and shared through the DMs, and people will get their forks come for my heads. But the math is math. Like you're not going to overcome the fact that you're not going to catch a bunny rabbit put in a box of steak at the base of a tree. You're going to get a coyote. You're going to get a wolf. You're going to get some significant problems. And one of our counterparts that's a Soil Food Web, we actually have two Soil Food Web buddies that have had access to DNA testing of various composts. And over the last handful of years, they've done a significant amount of actual DNA testing of compost procedures, different types of compost procedures. One of those guys did DNA analysis of IMO 1, IMO 2, and IMO 3. And each step of the way, it got more and more and more pathogen rich. It got more and more and more problem rich. And in the IMO 2 or 3, I can't remember, we'll have to have them on the show, but somewhere around IMO 2 or IMO 3 actually started creating brain parasites and like extremely unhealthy compounds that are not only problematic to plants, they're actually probably pretty bad for your health. One of them, I think, was defined as a nematode that infects the brain of horses. So it's going to be pretty hard to grow healthy crops. And, the real difficult part for the community to understand is if you take like our view of the world, and again, I don't know that there's many people on planet Earth that have done as much crop loss analysis as my wife and I in the cannabis space. And we've seen a lot of things, and we come in and put the analytics to this process, define the actual root cause, and then our business formulates a plan for correcting these issues. And we're not just cannabis people. Like we enjoy working with cannabis because it's such a teaching plant. And within 20 minutes, if you did something that plant liked or didn't like. Then there's the aspect of regulated compliance testing, where we have been scrutinized in regulated cannabis more than any other agricultural in the history of mankind. And in that process of trying to navigate this narrow hole, we've figured out how to perfectly fertilize a plant that doesn't induce pest and disease issues, and perfectly fertilize a plant that does not create mold problems. So that experience is priceless and will continue to serve me for the rest of my life. And I am eternally grateful for the cannabis plant, the cannabis process, and as ugly as it has gotten in the cannabis world, and as bad as it has gotten, and there's been a lot of bad, what's coming out of this is absolutely amazing. And the transition that's happened is absolutely amazing. I'm eternally grateful for that. And I forgot where I was going with that. Sorry, I got off on a tangent. I have to rewind the tape. What the hell was I talking about, Noah? Oh, yeah. So, yes, we've done a tremendous amount of crop loss analysis in cannabis, determined the root cause through data and analytics, and then formulated a plan. But we've also worked with a whole lot of other crops. We've worked with farmers that are growing 6,000 acres of corn and soy. Last month, I did the mineral chemistry for the soil that's going into a federal cemetery. I also did the mineral chemistry and math for a soil company that extended the runway of an airport. I've worked with, provided data and analytics for famous botanical gardens. We have helped city parks and recs convert from chemical strategies to organic strategies. I've damn near worked with every type of cultivation on the planet at this point. And the plant health problems that are coming out of this natural farming community undeniably are number one, most bizarre, most sudden death inducing than anything I've ever seen in my entire life. And so what we have to be really mindful as cultivators and farmers and what I think we're trying to be as stewards of the land, is if the processes that you're using, regardless of how good they make you feel, how good the story makes you feel, if it induces sudden death of a plant and your process creates pathogenic brain parasites, like we need to analyze that honestly. We need to analyze that clearly, and we need to do it pretty fast, right? So I try to be very careful saying scary things, but I've been literally analyzing the environment for over a decade. In 2000, what year was that? 2017. I think 2017, we worked with a guy that was working with the Healthy Soils Initiative. And I actually did, not I, my wife Sarah, did microscope assessment of forests in Southern California and saw that the biological population was less than half of what Dr. Elaine has defined as a healthy region for a forest system of that type. The planet's on a pretty solid nosedive. I don't want to get into the argument of if it's human induced or natural or whatever, like whatever the cause may be. I don't need some fancy scientist to tell me about the impending doom. I measure it every single day. Every single day in my work do I measure the current state of health of humans, of health of plants, of health of soils, and how certain popular trends are either helping that or hindering that. And what we really need to analyze and look very clearly at in the mirror as regenerative and sustainable stewards of the land. If your strategy is inducing immediate plant death and pathogens and stuff falling over, that's a long way from regenerative. It's nowhere near sustainable, and it's kind of the opposite. So what we're simply trying to communicate is like an honest analysis of what's going on, what is popular, who's saying what, and what we're going to do as a human population moving forward from this point, right? And we need to look honestly. And you know, one of the things that I'm so grateful for about my upbringing is I was raised by a bunch of really strong-headed people that didn't really care what other people taught. I was literally told as a young man, be as good as you can be. Don't worry about other people. Don't try to pick fights. Don't try to start problems. But you are not going to let other people's small minds limit your potential. And I took that very seriously. And I saw a lot of family members do very great things. I have several family members that hold collegiate records in different sports. I have family members that hold records in racing. If there was records in cannabis, my wife would damn sure hold 2 of those. And I feel like I hold a couple of those as well. And I'm trying to simply be as best as I can be. I'm trying to push the envelope. I'm trying to wake up every single day to see if I can be a little bit better. Every day it doesn't do that. A lot of times I go backwards, we'll be honest, but that's what we evaluate at the end of the year. And Sarah and I really dial down for a couple weeks and we get real nerdy about it. You don't have to get as nerdy as we do, but we sit down and write it out. It's like, what went well this year? What went wrong last year? And what I'm simply trying to propose is that the regenerative community takes an honest 12-step look at what its life is going like. We're causing a lot of problems right now. It's not helping our narrative. It's not helping our movement in the world. It's not helping convince people to get off chemicals and switch to sustainable regenerative studies. And we're in this weird era of, like I said, we went from person-to-person communication in the early years of cannabis, which moved to the hydroponic store. And now we're in this like weird social media influencer era where I think it ranges from people trying to mean well. There's definitely people that are con men and know they're con men, and they know that we know that they're con men. and the whole thing's just really bizarre right now. And so what I'm simply advocating for is a method of discernment that allows the farmer to make decisions and look honestly at what's going on. I have traveled the world to find the strategies that lead to the best analytics and answer to the farmers to guide their process. There are very few things that provide as much benefit as the microscope method for analyzing organisms in the soil. Obviously, we love soil chemistry. Obviously, we analyze fertilization. But the regenerative community and the living soil at whole really should probably start incorporating some microscope assessment if we're going to go talking about biology, right? End rant. So, and it is interesting, Bluegelia. That must mean That must mean stoned koala bear. But yeah, it is super interesting, and I hope you got some value. Again, we got some masterclass coming up February 2nd. We're starting the new channels. Check the chat below for the links. There's a couple leftover questions I'll try to do. I'm getting pretty long here tonight. But so EM1, are you down with or are you not? Okay, so I call EM1 the gateway drug to living soil systems. And if you are farming organically in any type, whether that's hydroponics, soilless media with organic nutrients going into a soilless media, or you're farming in your backyard, if you've previously done no biological treatments and you introduce EM1, there is a measurable benefit. Excuse me. And the first thing that I got introduced to was IMO. No, excuse me, IMO's on the screen. EM1. And when I first used EM1, there was a noticeable beneficial increase in my garden. I thought, wow, this stuff is great. The problem with EM1 is people stop there. And if you look at like a scale of where organisms come into play, EM1 is like one species of bacteria that happens at the start of an ecosystem. So if you are below the level needed to produce good biological growth to help your above ground plant, and you don't have any real measurable biology in there, and you put EM1 in there, you've moved yourself up the rung of the ladder. If you stop there, I think you're missing the entire point of living soil systems. And if you really try to wrap your mind around what's happening, I hear different numbers all the time, but let's just say there's an unimaginable number of bacterial species in a healthy soil. I've heard 10,000s, 100,000s, maybe millions. The more that they measure, the more they say they don't know. I personally stopped caring how many there were as far as species. But if you look at one organism and try to think that's the end all be all, I think you're missing the entire point. Can it be a beneficial component of the system? Yes. But what I see problematic with those that purport and really push the EM1 and then they call themselves living soil, they're not living soil. They're doing hydroponics with organic, quasi-organic, high levels of sulfates. I don't call that living soil. I call that like modified hydroponics. And because living soil is popular, they add that name on there. And in that system, EM1 basically is like a garbage collector, and it kind of cleans up the funk. It'll digest biofilms, and for that context, very effective. If you go to any of our client gardens that are using a biologically complete compost, or any of our Masterclass gardens that are using biologically complete compost, if you put EM1 in, you're not going to see any benefit at all, because when you start to get the full soil food web set of organisms, you're so far above EM1. You're probably not going to see any measurable benefit. But EM1 is in, I believe it would be in what they call the facultative anaerobic zone. So you got the oxygen-rich environment, you got the oxygen-lacking environment, and in the middle is this thing called the facultative anaerobic zone, which is kind of like a transition team as the ecosystem moves back and forth. And when you're in that range, sure, EM1 can provide a benefit. There are a couple people in the cannabis space that make EM1 and they don't use a microscope to analyze their process. But when we come behind them after the farms that have used this have actually experienced crop loss and are on the verge of going out of business, and we just do a simple microscope look of this EM1, it's loaded with this thing called an omycete, which literally is the cause for powdery mildew and mite pressure. So when we get a focus on EM1 and we make it ourselves and we're not using a microscope to assess that process, I would define that as irresponsible and reckless. And at best, it's novice. You know what I mean? Like if you're going to talk publicly about biology, like put the rubber to the road, like measure it, quantify it, and be about it. And so it's just kind of a weird time in the evolution of organics. And I saw a very big evolution of hydroponics. I've provided data and analytics for hydroponic farms paid for by rappers. I've been in the hydroponic world. And what's interesting about the hydro world is in that community, it's most important to be good at your job and be the best at your job. And in the organic world, it's more about the community. It's not disrupting the status quo. It's not speaking ill against other people and just kind of kumbayaing your way into crop loss. And I'm never going to get with that. I'm not trying to be inflammatory. I'm not trying to be a dick, but I'm never going to pretend something's okay if it's not okay. And so I tend to behave more like with the discernment and attention to detail and the discipline and almost kind of like militaristic regiment of the hydroponic culture that I came from, which that hydroponic culture was developed in secrecy and privacy, one-to-one, man-to-man, man-to-woman, homie to homie. And organics in the living soil is really coming to age in this like make-believe influencer, sponsor, athlete world. And that's created like this really dystopian world of like nonsense. And we really got to lock it up, man. We really got to lock it up. We really got to demand more from those people that call themselves guru, demand more from ourselves to be discerning, demand more from ourselves to get to the bottom of what the root cause is. Stop playing kumbaya, stop pretending that things are okay, and addressing the root causes because, we're into limited years of human survivability. Like, let's be real. How many years do we actually have left? Maybe 10 if we don't make radical change. I'm not going to pretend on the internet that everything's okay. The shit on us is on fire, and we're just saying IMO. Like, we got to knock it off. With that, I'm getting too far off the rails. I can feel like it's time to go. I'm going to get in trouble. But for those of you that stayed on this long, I appreciate you. Click the link for Science Bro. We're going live next week, and we're going to talk exclusively about cannabis. And I'm going to open up about cannabis like you've never seen in your entire life. And we're going to bring some like real hard-hitting commercial badassery to you. If you're into that, hit the like and subscribe. On this channel, we're going to keep it just living soil. I don't want to talk about cannabis specifically. The unfortunate reality is it offends the people that we're also trying to affect. The food people are real sensitive. They think cannabis is the devil. And I think if they would hold themselves to the standard that we do in regulated cannabis as far as testing, we'd have a much better quality food supply. So that's what we're trying to do with this channel. And in partnership with Dan Kittredge from the Bionutrient Food Association, we're going to try and impart some knowledge we've learned in the regulated cannabis space, which is difficult, and do our best to hold food farmers to a higher standard of analysis of their process to increase the food supply so humans can maybe make it another handful of years. I don't know. You let me know. Like or subscribe. See you next time, homies.